She arrived in a silk dress and button gloves. In the middle of a blizzard, the man who ordered a wife built for survival stared at her like she was a funeral he hadn't planned for. She had no business being alive up here. Neither did the secret she was carrying. One wrong move, and the mountain would bury them both. What happens when the woman running for her life lands in the arms of a man who answers to no one? Stay with me, because this story doesn't go where you think it does. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, and Silas Ashcroft had already decided to leave. He stood at the edge of the Cutter's Bend relay station with his hat pulled low against the wind, one boot propped on the fence rail, arms crossed. Around him, the small crowd of men who'd come to collect supplies or send letters had already drifted back inside where the stove was. Nobody stayed outside in late October in Colorado territory unless they had a reason, or a stubbornness that bordered on sickness. Silas had both. He'd spent the better part of 3 years convincing himself he didn't need anyone. The first winter alone had nearly killed him, not from cold or starvation, but from the particular madness that creeps in when a man goes 67 days without hearing another human voice. He'd started talking to the mule, then to the walls. By January, he'd been holding full conversations with a cracked tin cup he'd named Douglas. That was when he'd written the letter to the Montana Frontier Marriage Agency. Not for love. He wanted to be clear about that, clear to himself mostly. He needed a partner who could work, someone who understood that the cabin sat at 8,000 feet and that the nearest town was a 4-hour ride in good weather and completely unreachable once the high passes snowed in. He needed someone who could split wood without asking him to do it, who wouldn't scream at a mouse, who could read a sky and know when to bring the animals inside. He'd been specific in the letter, practical, experienced with frontier conditions, unafraid of hard labor. He had not asked for beautiful. He had not asked for silk. The stagecoach rolled in, throwing mud and noise, the lead horse blowing hard from the climb, and the driver barely had the brake set before he was hollering down from the box. "Got a passenger for Ashcroft! Ashcroft! You here?" Silas pushed off the fence and walked forward. The coach door opened, and the woman who stepped out looked like she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere around Philadelphia and hadn't figured it out yet. She was tall, taller than he'd expected, though he didn't know why he'd expected anything. She wore a deep blue traveling dress with a fitted jacket, the kind of thing that had buttons up to the throat and didn't have a single practical pocket in it. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a hat that had somehow survived the journey, mostly intact, which was more than could be said for the rest of her. Mud had splattered the hem of her skirt up to the knee. One glove was torn at the knuckle. There was a cut above her eyebrow. Small, dried now, but recent, and the way she held her chin up when she stepped onto the ground told him she knew exactly how she looked and had decided not to care about it. She looked around the station with dark, sharp eyes, landed on him. "Mr. Ashcroft?" Her voice was steady. That surprised him. "Yeah," he said. She walked toward him through the mud without flinching, extended her hand, the torn glove, and said, "Evelyn Blackthorne, I understand you're expecting me." He shook her hand because it would have been rude not to. Her grip was firmer than most men he knew. "You're from the agency," he said. It wasn't a question. He was stalling while his brain caught up with his eyes. "I am." He looked past her at the coach. 2 large trunks were being unloaded from the rear, heavy ones, judging by the way the station hand was struggling. He looked back at her. "Those yours?" "Yes." "Both of them?" "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Miss Blackthorne." "Mrs. Blackthorne. Technically, though the marriage was... It's Evelyn. Please." He started over. "Evelyn, I wrote to the agency and I was very clear about what I needed. I live at high altitude. The work is physical. We don't get social visits. We don't get mail between November and March. There's no doctor closer than Harwick, which is 4 hours by horse in good conditions," she said. "I read your specification letter. The agency shared it with me." He blinked. "Then you know what you're walking into." "I know what the letter said." "That's not an answer." She looked at him for a moment, not flustered, not apologetic, measuring, like she was deciding how much to say. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said finally, I am aware that I don't look the part. I'm aware that you expected someone else. But I'm here, and my trunks are here, and the agency has already been paid. A pause. I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking you to take me up that mountain. Silas stared at her. Behind him, one of the station hands, a stocky kid named Perch, who was missing 2 fingers and had no filter on his mouth, leaned over and stage whispered, "That's a real fancy woman, Mr. Ashcroft. You sure she ain't gonna cry when she sees the cabin?" Silas ignored him. He was still watching Evelyn, waiting for something. A crack, a flinch, some sign that the steadiness was a performance. He didn't see one. "The mountain road's rough," he said, "especially with those trunks adding weight. We hit bad weather. We could lose a wheel or worse." "Then we'd better start before the weather gets worse," she said. He almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because nothing about this day was going the way it was supposed to. And at some point, that stops being a problem and starts being a fact. "Fine," he said. "Help me load." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed one handle of the nearest trunk and dragged it toward the wagon before he even had the tailgate down. It took both of them to lift it in. Perch watched with his mouth open. Boy, they didn't talk much for the first hour. The road out of Cutter's Bend wound upward through stands of aspen that had already gone gold, most of the leaves stripped now by the wind. The sky was white and heavy with the kind of clouds that didn't threaten. They promised. Silas drove, keeping his attention on the road and the mule team, watching the lead animal's ears for signs of skittishness. The trail narrowed as they climbed, dropping off sharply on the left side where the mountain fell away into a rocky gulch 100 feet below. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench and looked out at all of it without speaking. He'd expected questions. Most people had questions. Is it always this cold? How far is it? Is there a town nearby? He'd prepared himself for that particular brand of gentle panic that city people wore like a second coat when the landscape got serious. Instead, she watched the ridgeline, watched the way the wind moved through the pine tops, watched a hawk work a thermal above the gulch without a single wing beat. "You're not what I expected either," she said after a long silence. "What'd you expect?" "Older, dirtier." She paused. "Less observant." "I'm observant?" "You haven't stopped checking the sky since we left the station." He had been. Storm coming. He could feel it in the air, in the pressure dropping against his eardrums, in the way the mule on the right kept tossing its head. "Storm's coming," he said. "I thought so." She looked up, then back at the road. "How bad?" "Don't know yet. Could be nothing. Could be the first real one of the season." "How long until we reach the cabin?" 3 hours, maybe less if we push." She nodded and didn't say anything else. Silas found that he didn't know what to do with a quiet woman. He'd expected to spend the journey managing nerves, reassuring someone, repeating himself, answering the same question 3 different ways. Instead, he was sitting next to a woman who looked at a 200-foot drop on her left side and adjusted her coat collar. He was so caught up in that thought that he almost missed the sound. A crack, thin and sharp, like a joint popping, coming from the left rear wheel. He felt it through the bench half a second later. A wobble. Not bad yet, but enough. "We've got a problem," he said, already pulling back on the reins. "The wheel?" "Rear left. I need to stop and check it. There's a flat spot ahead, maybe 30 yards. He was guiding the team toward it when the second crack came, louder this time, and the wagon lurched hard left. The mule on that side screamed and shied right, and the whole rig swayed toward the edge. Silas grabbed the reins with both hands and hauled, but the left mule was panicking now, driving against its partner, and for one horrible second the right rear wheel lifted off the ground, and he could see the gulch coming toward them, the white sky and the drop in the rocks 100 feet down. "Give me the reins." Evelyn's voice, right next to him, calm. He didn't think. He handed them over. She took them with both hands, set her feet against the board, and she didn't fight the panicking mule. She didn't haul against it the way his instinct had told him to. She let out just enough slack to stop the animal fighting the bit, then pressed steady, even pressure, talking low the whole time. Not words exactly, just sound, just her voice, level and continuous. A sound that said, "I'm here," and I'm not afraid in whatever language mules understood. The left animal's ears came up, still trembling, still wide-eyed, but no longer driving sideways. The wagon settled back onto four wheels. Silas realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out. Evelyn held the reins steady for another 10 seconds, then guided both animals slowly, carefully, toward the flat turnout ahead. She brought them to a stop, set the brake, and handed the reins back. She didn't say you're welcome. She didn't say anything. She climbed down and walked back to look at the wheel. Silas sat on the bench for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he climbed down too. The wheel wasn't broken, Bent spoke. Loose iron on the rim. He had the tools to fix it. It took 40 minutes, kneeling in the cold with his hands going numb, and Evelyn held the animals' heads the whole time without being asked. When he was done, he wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her. "Where'd you learn to handle a team like that?" She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the spoke he'd replaced, checking his work without making it obvious she was checking his work. "My father," she said finally. "He was a teamster?" "No." She looked up. "He was a physician, but he believed in teaching practical skills. He said a person who can only do one thing is a person who can be cornered." Silas thought about that. "Smart man," he said. He was. Past tense. She turned and walked back to the wagon. They made it to the cabin an hour before the storm hit. It wasn't much to look at. Silas knew that. He'd built most of it himself over 3 years, adding to what a previous trapper had left behind. Log walls chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney that drew well, a covered porch where he kept his wood stacked, a lean-to attached on the south side for the animals. Inside, one main room with the stove and table and his bookshelves, a sleeping loft above, a curtained corner where he'd added a second sleeping area when he'd written the letter. Not large. Not comfortable by any standard she was probably used to. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at it. He waited for the reaction. Couldn't help it. She stepped inside. Looked at the stove. Looked at the shelves. He had books, a fair number of them, which sometimes surprised people. Looked at the curtained corner. Turned around once, slowly, taking inventory. "The stove draws well?" she asked. "Better in cold weather than warm." "Good." She set her small travel bag on the table. "I'll need to learn how to use it, tonight, if possible." "I can show you." "And the well? Is it close?" 40 yards east. I'll show you that too." She nodded, put her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. The torn glove, the dried mud on her cuffs, the cut above her eye that had started to bleed again faintly from the cold. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, without looking up. "Silas." "Silas." She raised her eyes. "I need you to understand something, and I'd rather say it plainly than have it come out sideways later." She paused. "I'm not here under false pretenses about the work. I'll carry my weight. I'll learn what I don't know. I won't complain about the conditions or ask you to change them." Another pause. Shorter. "What I'm asking is that you don't ask me about my past. Not yet. There are things I'll tell you when I can, but not tonight." Outside, the first real gust of the storm hit the cabin. The walls shuddered. Silas looked at her for a long moment, at the cut she probably hadn't admitted to feeling, at the steadiness she was working to maintain, at the 2 heavy trunks sitting outside in the weather that he didn't know the contents of and hadn't asked about. A smarter man might have pushed, asked the question she was warning him away from. But he'd spent 3 winters alone at 8,000 feet. He understood the difference between privacy and dishonesty. He understood that some things had to be earned before they could be spoken. "All right," he said. He walked past her to the door, pulled his coat back on, and went to haul the trunks inside before the storm got serious. She followed him out without being asked. Together they got both trunks through the door just as the snow started coming sideways. He kicked the door shut behind them and threw the latch, and the sound of the wind went from a roar to a moan. The cabin felt smaller with 2 people in it. He got the stove going while she hung her ruined jacket on the hook by the door. In the orange firelight, with the wind working against the chimney and the snow ticking against the single window, the cabin was tight and close and warm. Silas put a pot of water on and showed her how to manage the damper. She paid attention like she was memorizing something she'd need to pass a test on. He didn't ask what she was running from. She didn't ask what had made him lonely enough to write a letter to strangers. The storm leaned onto the cabin all night, and neither of them slept much. But by morning, the stove was still burning, and the animals were still alive in the lean-to, and Evelyn Blackthorne was standing at the window, watching the snow come down with an expression on her face that he couldn't name. Not fear, not regret. Something quieter than both of those. Something that looked almost like relief. Silas put coffee on and didn't say anything. Some things, he'd learned, didn't need words to be understood. The first week Silas tested her. He didn't do it on purpose. Or at least that's what he told himself when he lay awake in the loft, listening to the wind work the chimney and the occasional sound of her turning over on the cot behind the curtain below. He told himself he was simply going about his routine, and if that routine happened to be brutal by most people's standards, that wasn't his problem. The mountain didn't adjust itself for newcomers. Neither did he. He was up before dawn every morning. That was non-negotiable. The animals needed feeding before the temperature dropped further at first light. The water trough needed breaking if it had frozen overnight, and the firewood supply on the porch needed rotating so the wettest logs were always on the outside and the dry ones near the door. These were not chores. They were the difference between functioning and not functioning, and in November at 8,000 feet, not functioning had a permanent solution. The first morning, he came downstairs from the loft at 4:45, expecting to find the main room dark and cold and Evelyn asleep. Instead, she was standing at the stove in her coat, with her hair still loose down her back, feeding kindling into the firebox. She'd already put water on. She looked up when she heard him on the ladder. "I didn't know the exact ratio," she said, meaning the wood to kindling. "I guessed." "You guessed right," he said, because she had. He pulled his boots on and went outside. She followed him 3 minutes later, buttoned up to the throat, and didn't ask where they were going. She just fell in behind him and watched what he did, and when he handed her the mallet to break the ice on the trough, she broke it without ceremony. He'd expected questions. He'd expected resistance. He'd expected the slow, grinding negotiation of someone adjusting their expectations downward, that particular kind of daily disappointment he'd watched break people before on mountains like this one. Instead, she just kept showing up. That was the thing about Evelyn Blackthorne that Silas couldn't quite get a handle on in those first days. She didn't perform competence the way some people did, loudly, with commentary about how hard it was, wanting credit for each thing accomplished. She simply did what needed doing and moved on to the next thing. And if she didn't know how to do something, she watched until she did, and then she did it. The second morning, he found her at the woodpile with the short axe, trying to split a round that was too green to split cleanly. She'd been at it a while. He could tell from the way she was breathing and the fact that she'd taken her coat off despite the cold, which meant she'd been generating enough heat that the coat had become a liability. Her form was wrong. She was chopping at it from the shoulder instead of letting the weight of the axe do the work, which meant she was burning twice the energy for half the result. He stood at the corner of the cabin and watched her for a moment. She missed the center, caught the edge, and the axe bounced off sideways. She said something under her breath that he didn't quite catch, but that didn't sound remotely ladylike. "You're fighting it," he said. She stopped and looked at him, not embarrassed, just out of breath. "I can see that," she said. "You want me to show you?" A short pause. "Yes." He walked over and took the axe. "You're swinging from here," he said, touching his shoulder. "The axe is heavy enough that you don't have to. You just have to aim and let it fall. The weight does the splitting if you set it right." He demonstrated on a different round. Set the axe head, let it drop with a small guide from both wrists, and the wood came apart in 2 clean pieces. She watched. "The green ones don't split as well," he said. "Start with the dry ones. You can tell by the color of the end grain and the weight. Dry wood is lighter than it looks." She picked up one of the rounds he'd pointed to, turned it over, looked at the end grain, nodded, set it on the block, adjusted her grip on the axe handle the way he'd shown her, and split it on the second try. Not perfect, but clean enough. She didn't look at him to see if he'd noticed. She just set up the next one. Silas went back inside and stood at the window for a moment watching her work. She split 4 more rounds before stopping, stacking them neatly against the wall with the cut faces out the way he'd stacked his. Then she put her coat back on and rolled her shoulders like something ached and picked up the axe again. He turned away from the window before she caught him looking. By the end of the first week, she had blisters on both palms. He knew because he saw her wrapping them with strips of cloth from the small bag she kept on the shelf beside the cot, working quietly in the early morning light before he came down. She didn't mention them. He didn't ask. But he left a small tin of the salve he used for rope burns on the shelf near her things, and the next morning it had been moved. The days had a rhythm to them that surprised him by being comfortable. Not easy. Comfortable in the way that physical work with a clear purpose is comfortable, in that your body knows what it's doing even when your mind is somewhere else. They divided the labor without ever sitting down to discuss it. She took the interior work, cooking, maintaining the fire, organizing the food stores, the small repairs inside that he'd been putting off for months. He took the exterior, some wood, animals, the trap line that ran 3 miles north through the timber, the maintenance of the cabin walls and roof before the heavy snow came. They ate together at the table every evening. That part was harder. Not hostile, just careful. Like two people who had each decided to speak slowly and choose their words, which meant the silences between sentences were longer than they needed to be, and both of them were aware of it. The third night, she put a plate in front of him, and he looked at it and then at her. "You can cook," he said. "Don't sound so surprised." "I wrote to the agency that cooking was a requirement." "I know." She sat down across from him. "I'm telling you not to sound surprised that I met it." He looked at his plate again. It was a venison stew. He'd had the meat stored, and she'd found the dried herbs he kept in a tin on the top shelf and used them, which meant she'd been investigating the kitchen stores without telling him, which he supposed was practical and slightly irritating in equal measure. "It's good," he said. "The herbs are almost gone," she said. "What do you use most?" "Rosemary, thyme if I can get it, sage. I can write a list for when you go to town." "I won't go to town until March." She absorbed that without visible reaction. "Then I'll work with what's here." They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the wind was picking up again. It was always picking up again. And the fire popped, and the cabin settled around them in the way old buildings do, talking to themselves in creaks and sighs. "The books," she said finally, nodding toward the shelves. "What about them? Have you read all of them? Most?" She studied the spines from across the room. He had a mixed collection, some practical guides on trapping and woodcraft, a few histories, some fiction he'd traded for in Harwick over the years. Dickens, 2 of them. A water-stained Cooper. A volume of Emerson that a previous owner had annotated heavily in the margins. "You can read them," he said, "if you want." "I brought my own." A pause. "I brought a lot of my own." He thought about the trunks, about how heavy they were. "That's what's in them. Books?" A small hesitation, barely a second. "Among other things." He didn't push it, but he thought about it. The second week, the temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight, and the trap line became critical. He was gone most of the day on those runs, returning in the afternoon with what he'd caught, and he fell into the habit of arriving back to find the cabin warm and something on the stove, and Evelyn doing whatever she was doing without looking up when he came in, which he realized he had started to count on in a way he hadn't expected. One afternoon, he came back to find she'd moved the furniture. It was a small thing. She'd shifted the table 6 inches toward the window and rotated one of the chairs so it faced the stove rather than the wall. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it. "Better light," she said, without looking up from whatever she was stitching. "It's my cabin," he said. "It is." She looked up then. "Does it bother you?" It didn't. That was the truthful answer. The new arrangement was actually better. He didn't know why he'd had the table where it was, other than habit, and habit was a poor reason to keep anything. "No," he said, and went to hang up his coat. She nodded and went back to her stitching. He watched her for a second from the corner of his eye. Her hands moved with a precision that didn't quite match the domestic nature of the task. Small, deliberate movements, each stitch exactly placed. He'd noticed that before, the way she used her hands. There was a specificity to it that he couldn't name. He went outside to clean the catch and didn't bring it up. The nights were the hardest part for reasons he didn't entirely want to examine. Not because anything inappropriate was happening. They'd established their arrangement the first night without discussion. The curtained corner hers, the loft his, and neither of them had suggested otherwise. The hardest part was simply lying in the dark and being aware that another person was breathing 12 feet below him. He'd forgotten what that was like. The sound of another person sleeping. For the first 3 years, the silence at night had been so complete he'd been able to hear his own heartbeat, which is something a man doesn't want to spend too much time listening to alone. Now there was the sound of the wind and the fire, and, if the night was quiet enough, the soft rhythm of Evelyn's breathing from behind the curtain, and he slept better than he had in 3 years and didn't know what to do with that information. The trouble came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, though Silas had stopped tracking days precisely long ago and only knew it was a Tuesday because Evelyn had written the date on the top of a page in the small journal she kept on the shelf, and he'd seen it when he reached past her for the tin of coffee. November 14th. He'd gone up the trap line early because the sky the night before had promised weather, and he wanted to clear the northern sets before the snow came. He was 3 miles in when he found the prints. Not animal, boot prints. A man's, by the size and depth, heading north along the same game trail he used for the line. They were a day old, at least, frosted at the edges where the temperature had dropped overnight. Someone had walked this trail recently and hadn't announced themselves. That happened sometimes. Trappers moved through territory without stopping. Prospectors occasionally, though the season was wrong for that. It didn't mean anything necessarily. But it sat wrong in his stomach for the rest of the morning, and he cleared the line faster than usual and came back down the mountain in the early afternoon with a cold feeling between his shoulder blades that had nothing to do with the temperature. He didn't tell Evelyn about the prints. He told himself there was nothing to tell. He told himself it was probably nothing. He told himself it wasn't his business what she was running from, and that without knowing what it was, he had no way of knowing whether boot prints on a northern trail had anything to do with her or not. He told himself all of that, and then he spent an hour that evening cleaning his rifle when it didn't need cleaning. She noticed. She was sitting at the table with a book open in front of her, but she'd stopped turning pages about 20 minutes in. He could tell because the firelight didn't shift the way it did when someone moves a page. "What happened?" she said. He didn't look up from the barrel. "Nothing." Silas. He set the rifle across his knees and looked at her. She was watching him with those dark, steady eyes. The book had been closed at some point without him noticing. "There were boot prints on the northern trail," he said. "A day old, man-size. Moving through, probably, but—" He stopped. "But," she said, "but it's the wrong time of year for most of the people who come through here." Silence. The fire popped. "How far north?" she asked. Her voice was controlled, but he watched her hands on the table and they had gone very still. 3 miles. Maybe a bit more. She nodded slowly. Her jaw was working like she was chewing on something that tasted bad. He waited. "It's probably nothing," she said. "Probably." She looked at the fire. He looked at her. There was something moving behind her eyes. A calculation. A fear she was deciding whether to let out or swallow back down. She swallowed it. "All right," she said, and picked up the book again. He looked at her for another moment. Then he finished with the rifle and loaded it and set it against the wall beside the door. She didn't comment on that either. What he didn't know, what neither of them said out loud in the fire-lit quiet of that cabin, was that the careful distance they'd been maintaining was already starting to close. Not through any dramatic event, not through confession or declared intention. Just through the slow, inevitable way that two people who are honest in their daily actions start to know each other in ways that words don't cover. He knew, for instance, that she woke at the same time every night, somewhere around 2 a.m, and lay still for exactly a few minutes before her breathing evened back out. He didn't know what she was listening for, but he knew she was listening. She knew, for instance, that he came back from the trap line on the hard days and stood outside for a while before coming in. Not long, 5 minutes, sometimes less. Just standing in the cold with his face turned up, which she'd thought at first was about the weather, and later understood was about something else entirely. About needing a moment between the wilderness and the small enclosed world of the cabin, where the fire was warm and she was there. Neither of them acknowledged knowing these things, but knowing them changed something quietly and without announcement. The way the temperature drops degree by degree until you look up and realize the water in the bucket has frozen solid, and you don't know exactly when it happened. The day the accident came, it started like every other day. Cold, clear sky, the good kind that meant no immediate weather, the air so dry it cracked his lips on the first breath outside. Silas had been working on the dead pine at the northwest corner of the clearing for 3 days now. A big tree, maybe 70 feet, that had come down in a windstorm 2 autumns ago and landed in a way that made it both excellent future firewood and a current structural hazard to the corner of the lean-to where it lay across the roof. He needed to cut it into manageable sections and haul them back before the heavy snow pinned it down for the winter and made the whole job twice as hard in spring. Evelyn was inside. He could see the smoke from the chimney, which meant the stove was running, which meant the cabin was warm, which meant everything was as it should be. He worked for 2 hours without trouble. The tree was dense and slightly green still from moisture trapped in the bark, which made for slow cutting, and he'd worked his way through the crown section and into the main trunk by mid-morning. The midsection was the problem. The trunk had fallen across a slight rise in the ground and was suspended 6 inches off the earth in the middle, which meant when he cut through it, the 2 halves would fall in unpredictable directions depending on where the weight distributed. He knew this. He'd done this kind of cut before. He made his assessment of the fall line, moved to what he judged was the safe side, and began the cut. He was halfway through when the trunk shifted. It was a small movement, an inch, maybe less, as the balance point changed under the saw. He started to step back. His right boot heel caught a branch stub hidden under the snow, a dead 3-inch spike pointing upward, and his footing went wrong. The trunk came down, not directly on him. His reflexes got him sideways in time for that. But the impact on the frozen ground sent a shockwave through the earth, and the suspended section snapped back on the hinge point with a force he hadn't calculated, and the butt end swung up and caught him across the left side. His ribs, his shoulder, the side of his head, and drove him into the ground hard enough that for a moment there was nothing. No sky, no cold, no sound, just dark. He came back to himself on his face in the snow, with blood in his mouth and the sound of his own heartbeat very loud in his ears. He didn't know how long he'd been down. His left arm wouldn't work correctly. When he tried to push himself up with it, the pain that came back was the kind that whites out your vision, and he dropped back down before he passed out again. He lay there and breathed and took inventory. Left shoulder, dislocated or broken, one or the other. Left side, ribs, at least 2, possibly more. Head. The warm he could feel running into the snow beside his face was blood. He didn't know how much. He got his right arm under him and pushed up slowly, and this time made it to his knees. The clearing tilted. He waited it out. He needed to get to the cabin. That was the only thought that mattered. Get to the cabin. 40 yards across the clearing. He could manage 40 yards. He was not entirely sure he could manage 40 yards. He made it to his feet by using the sawed section of trunk as a brace, and he stood swaying in the cold, clear air. And then across the clearing, the cabin door opened and Evelyn stepped out with a cup in her hand and looked at him. He watched the cup fall. He heard her running across the snow before he was able to track where she was with his eyes. Then she was in front of him with both hands on his face, and she was saying something, but the words weren't connecting to meaning properly. "I'm all right," he said. The words came out strange. "You are not all right," she said very clearly. "Don't argue with me. Put your arm around my shoulders. Your right arm, not the left. Don't touch the left. We're going inside." He wanted to tell her he could walk on his own. He probably could have. But she had already positioned herself under his right arm, and her shoulder was solid under his, and it was easier to let her than to waste energy arguing, and so he let her, and together they made it across 40 yards of frozen ground and through the door, and she got him to the table and sat him in the chair, and he gripped the table edge with his right hand and breathed. She was already at the trunks. He watched her through the swimming at the edge of his vision. Both trunks open, the lids thrown back, and she was moving with a speed and efficiency that was so completely different from how she moved in any other context that he blinked, and wondered if his head was worse than he'd thought. She came back to the table with a lamp and a cloth and a leather case he didn't recognize, and she set the lamp close to his face and looked at the cut on his head, with eyes that had gone from the dark, careful eyes he'd been looking at for 3 weeks to something else entirely. Focused in a way that had no warmth or coldness to it, just precise. "Look here," she said, meaning her finger. He tracked it. She watched his pupils, and whatever she saw made her exhale once through her nose. "The head wound isn't deep. It'll bleed considerably, but it's not the serious problem." She moved around behind him and touched his left shoulder, and he made a sound he was not proud of. "This is the serious problem," she said. "I need to know where it hurts most." He told her. She had her hands on his shoulder, both of them light and deliberate, and she was pressing in places that produced a very particular and unpleasant map of pain, and her expression while she did it was the expression of someone reading a document, not touching a person. But the hands themselves were careful. Even at their most purposeful, they were underneath careful. "It's dislocated," she said, "not broken. That's better than it could be." She moved back in front of him. "I'm going to need you to hold onto the table and not move." "What are you going to do?" he asked, though some part of him had already started to understand what she was going to do. She looked at him steadily. "Put it back," she said. He tightened his grip on the table. She did it fast, which was the only mercy in it, and the sound it made was something he would have preferred not to hear, and the pain was extraordinary and brief, and then the shoulder was back where it belonged, and he was gripping the table so hard his knuckles had gone white, and she was already moving to the leather case. "You need to tell me something," he said, when he could talk again. She was opening the case. He could see now what was inside. Glass instruments, steel tools with shapes he recognized from the one time a physician had come through Harwick 3 years ago and treated a mine accident. Proper medical equipment, not a traveler's basic kit, a physician's tools. "I know," she said. She didn't look up. "I will, but first let me stop this bleeding." She cleaned the cut on his head with a steadiness that didn't waver, threaded a needle with a thread finer than anything he owned, and put 4 stitches in while he sat at his own table and tried to understand what he was looking at. When she was done, she wrapped his ribs tight with cloth strips from the case and made him move the shoulder joint slowly through a range of motion and told him what to watch for. She used words he didn't entirely know. She used them precisely and without explanation, the way people use vocabulary that is simply native to them, that they've never had to think about as specialized because it's never been anything other than ordinary. Then she sat down across from him. Her hands were in her lap. The steadiness that had carried her through the last 40 minutes was still there, but underneath it now he could see something shaking loose. She was pale. She was breathing carefully. "Your hands are bleeding," he said. He'd noticed it while she worked. The blisters from the woodpile had opened sometime during the effort of the last hour. She looked down at them, seemed to notice for the first time. "I'll wrap them," she said. "Evelyn." She looked up. He held her gaze for a moment. 3 weeks of questions he hadn't asked. 3 weeks of distance maintained by mutual unspoken agreement. 3 weeks of boot prints on a northern trail and heavy trunks that nobody laughed about anymore. He didn't ask. Not yet. She told him she'd tell him when she could, and he'd said all right, and he was a man who kept his word. But he looked at her, and in the quiet that settled between them in the warm, bloody interior of the cabin, with the smoke going up and the mountain outside, and her hands bleeding in her lap, something was acknowledged that neither of them had names for yet. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, looked back down at her hands. Outside, the wind was starting to build again. Neither of them moved from the table for a long time. The fever came on the second night. Silas had gone to the loft, insisting he was fine, which was the kind of thing a man says when he is clearly not fine, but has spent too many years alone to know how to accept help gracefully. Evelyn had let him go. She'd learned in the past 3 weeks that pushing him directly was like pushing the cabin wall. It didn't move and you only hurt your hands. Better to wait. Better to let him think he'd won the small battle so she could manage the larger one. She sat by the stove and didn't sleep. Around midnight, she heard his breathing change, from the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man trying to sleep through pain to something faster and less controlled. She climbed the loft ladder without asking permission and put her hand on his forehead, and it was like pressing her palm against the stovepipe. "I'm fine," he said, without opening his eyes. "You have a fever," she said. "I know that. You need water." I know that too. Then stop arguing and drink this. She had the cup already. She'd been heating water with willow bark and a root compound from the smaller case. Not the leather physician's case, but a second wooden one he hadn't seen her open yet. She held the cup steady while he drank without fully sitting up, and he made a face at the taste, but he drank it. She sat at the top of the ladder with her back against the loft beam and kept watch. By 3 a.m, the fever had climbed. He was talking, not to her, not coherently. Names she didn't know. A place called Whitmore Creek. Once, with a clarity that startled her, he said, I should have gone back for him, and then fell silent for 10 minutes before starting again with something she couldn't make out. She came down, heated more water, added different compounds, went back up. Did this 4 times before dawn. When the light came gray through the single window, and the fever broke, not gone, but cresting, the temperature dropping to something workable, she was sitting on the floor of the loft with her back against the wall, and her eyes closed, not quite asleep, and not quite awake. Her hands ached. Her back ached. The cut on his head had bled through the dressing in the night, and she'd changed it twice, and there were rust-colored stains on the cuffs of her sleeves that she registered somewhere in the back of her mind and decided to deal with later. She heard him breathing slow and even out. She opened her eyes and looked at him. In sleep, without the careful containment he maintained in his waking hours, he looked younger. The lines around his mouth relaxed. His hands, which in the day were always doing something or ready to do something, lay open at his sides. He had a scar on his jaw she'd noticed before and wondered about, and another along his right forearm that was old and well-healed and that she'd catalogued without comment the way she catalogued everything about the people she cared for. She stood up quietly and went back down the ladder. There was work to do. The animals hadn't been fed, the fire had dropped to coals, the water trough needed breaking again. The trap line, she didn't know the trap line, had never walked it alone, but she'd gone with him twice and paid attention, and she thought she could manage the nearest sets, the ones within a mile. She did all of it. It took her most of the morning, and she did it badly in places and adequately in others, and the trap line she managed only half of. But she did it, and she came back to the cabin at noon with 2 rabbits and hands so cold she couldn't feel her smallest finger for 20 minutes. She built the fire back up and put the rabbits on and went to check on Silas. He was awake, watching the ceiling. He turned his head when she came up the ladder and looked at her coat, which had blood on the sleeve from where she'd caught her arm on a branch on the trail, at her face, which probably showed how tired she was in ways she wasn't controlling well. You did the animals, he said. Yes. And the trap line? The near sets. I didn't want to go further without knowing it better. He was quiet for a moment. Did you reset the 3rd snare? Past the big spruce? I didn't see a 3rd snare past the big spruce. It's buried. There's a bent stake. I marked them with a bent top so I can find them in snow. I'll go back this afternoon. You don't have to, Silas. She said it the way she'd learned to say it, flat and final. I'll go back this afternoon. He closed his mouth, opened it again. Evelyn, you can't. I caught 2 rabbits. I built the fire back. The water trough is broken, and the animals are fed, and there is broth on the stove. And I will go back for the 3rd snare this afternoon, and none of this is a discussion. She paused. Drink something. He stared at her. You're managing me, he said. I am absolutely managing you. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. He looked back at the ceiling. I don't like being managed. I know, she said. Most people who need managing don't. She went back down the ladder. The 3rd snare had caught nothing, but she reset it correctly. She found the bent stake under 3 inches of new snow, and came back before the temperature dropped in the late afternoon. She cooked the rabbits down with the dried vegetables from the root cellar, and brought him a bowl, and sat on the floor of the loft with her own bowl, and they ate in a silence that was different from the careful silences of the first 2 weeks. Less guarded. More like the silence of people who have moved past the stage of wondering if the other person is going to be a problem. Whitmore Creek, she said. He looked at her. You said it last night, during the fever, and you said, I should have gone back for him. He looked at his bowl. A muscle in his jaw worked once. My brother, he said. Cale. 7 years ago, we were running trap lines in Wyoming, early season, before the ice set properly. He went through. A pause. I was a mile south. I heard him. By the time I got there, he stopped. I was too slow. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned long ago that saying sorry to someone's grief was about the speaker's discomfort, not the listener's pain. Instead, she said, "You were a mile away in early season ice conditions. There is almost no version of that where you arrive in time." I know that. His voice was flat. Knowing it, and he didn't finish. And feeling it are different things, she said. Yes. She ate a spoonful of broth. He did the same. Is that why you came here? She asked. To this mountain. He considered the question longer than she expected. Partly. Also because I was tired of people who wanted things from me that I didn't know how to give. He looked at her sideways. You going to tell me that's avoidance? No, she said. I came to this mountain for similar reasons. He didn't push it. She'd known he wouldn't, but the truth was gathering between them like the weather she'd learned to read in the sky. The heavy clouds that built slowly from the northwest, the kind that meant not a passing squall but a real system, settling in for days. The truth she was carrying was building that way, and she could feel it. Not yet, but soon. Over the next 4 days, she managed everything alone. That was the part no one would have predicted when the stagecoach had pulled into Cutter's Bend and she'd stepped out in silk and ruined gloves. She split wood. Better now, cleaner strokes, her back and shoulders understanding the mechanics in a way they hadn't a month ago. She ran the near trapline every morning and extended her range each day, learning the marked stakes, learning the way the trail bent around the rock outcrop and where the packed snow was safe, and where it was deceptive, covering a creek run that would swallow a boot to the knee if you stepped wrong. She made mistakes. She stepped in the creek run on the second day, which cost her a wet foot and a cold hour getting back and dry, and she was furious with herself in a way she didn't perform for anyone. Just sat by the stove with her boot off and her sock hanging to dry and her jaw set, working through what she'd done wrong and how to do it differently. She burned the cornbread on day 3 because she'd gotten the damper position wrong and the stove ran too hot. And the burned smell filled the cabin, and she stood over the pan and thought several things she wouldn't say in polite company. She checked his stitches morning and evening, changed the head dressing, monitored the shoulder, checked the ribs by feel for any sign of the displacement she feared, a broken end pressing wrong. She administered the compounds she'd mixed from the wooden case, adjusting the concentrations as the fever moved, watching his temperature with her hand and her instincts and a small glass thermometer from the leather case that she'd started thinking of the way a carpenter thinks of a level, the tool that tells you true. On the morning of the 5th day, he came down the loft ladder on his own. She was at the table with a cup of coffee she'd been nursing for half an hour, going through the food inventory in her head. What was running low, what they had enough of, what she needed to start rationing. She looked up. He looked terrible. Pale, careful on his feet, the left arm held slightly away from his body the way people hold a thing that still hurts. He'd managed to dress himself, which she recognized as important to him, and so didn't comment on. He made it to the table and sat down heavily. She got up and poured him coffee without asking. He wrapped both hands around it and looked at the cabin. She watched him take inventory. The firewood stacked inside by the door, the organized food stores, the cleaned and organized kitchen area, the trapline gear she'd started hanging on his system of hooks, because hanging it correctly meant she didn't have to untangle things in the cold. You reorganized the hooks, he said. I followed your system. You extended it. You only had 4 hooks. I needed 6. He looked at the 2 new pegs she'd driven into the wall. She'd found the mallet and the right kind of nails in the toolbox under his bench, and she'd driven them in herself, which was not something she'd been able to do a month ago. He looked at her. Evelyn, he said. His voice was different from the fever version, different from the careful managed version, quieter. How are your hands? She looked down at them around her cup. The blisters had broken and healed to rough callus now at the base of her fingers. The left palm had a scrape from the creek run incident that had scabbed over. They were not the hands she'd arrived with. Fine, she said. That's not an answer. She looked up. They're sore. They're functional. They're fine. A pause. How is your shoulder? Sore. Functional. He almost smiled. Fine. She almost smiled back. They sat with their coffee and the fire and the wind outside, and the quiet between them was the most comfortable it had ever been, which made what she needed to say next harder, not easier, because comfortable things are harder to risk than uncomfortable ones. She set down her cup. I need to tell you something, she said. He didn't move, didn't tense exactly, but she felt the change in him, the attention sharpening. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. She folded her hands on the table, looked at them. You've had my secrets in your house for a month and you haven't asked for them, and that matters. So I want to tell you. He waited. She began at the beginning, which was the only honest place to begin, even if the beginning was hard. Her father had been a physician in St. Louis, not a fashionable one. He'd had a practice in the parts of the city where the fashionable ones didn't go, treating people who couldn't pay what medicine usually cost, taking what they could give, which was sometimes money and sometimes labor and sometimes nothing. She had grown up in those rooms, watching him work. She'd started helping at 12, which nobody thought was appropriate, and had stopped caring what was appropriate at around 13. By the time she was 17, she could suture a laceration, set a simple fracture, manage a birth without complications. When her father died, she was 22. She was already practicing, quietly, without the certificate that would have made it official, treating the people her father had treated in the rooms her father had used with the instruments her father had left her. She had two names in the city, the name people said in drawing rooms and the name people said in back streets when they needed someone who would come at night and not ask too many questions and not charge more than you had. Silas listened to all of this without speaking. It worked for 4 years, she said, and then a man named Harlan Voss found out about me. The name sat on the table between them. He was, she paused, he ran things in certain parts of St. Louis, certain kinds of commerce. He had men who got hurt in ways that required medical attention they couldn't seek through official channels. He came to me very politely and explained that he needed a physician on what he called a retainer arrangement. Her voice didn't waver, but her hands tightened against each other. He meant that I would treat his people exclusively, that I would keep records in a way he specified, that I would occasionally be present at events that I did not want to be present at. He was very calm about it. He made it clear that the alternative to agreeing was that someone would report my practice to the medical board, which would mean losing everything. He was also very clear, still calm, still polite, that if I caused him difficulty, I would regret it in ways that had nothing to do with professional licensing. She stopped. The fire was burning steadily. Outside, the wind moved through the pine tops with a sound like rushing water. What did you do? Silas asked. His voice was level, but she'd learned to hear what was underneath his level voice. I agreed. For 4 months I agreed because I was scared and I didn't see another way out. She looked at the fire. And then one of his men brought in a boy, 17 years old. He'd been used as a messenger for something that went wrong, and the people it went wrong with had beaten him badly enough that he had bleeding inside his skull. She paused. I could see it. I could feel it when I examined him. I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew that if someone didn't relieve that pressure within the hour, he would die. She stopped again. Voss told me not to bother. He said the boy had become a liability and that I should make him comfortable and let nature handle the rest. She let that settle. He said it the same way he said everything, calm, polite, like it was a reasonable medical recommendation. Silas said nothing, but his right hand on the table had closed into a fist. I operated, she said, with what I had, in a back room, alone. The boy lived. Voss he didn't hurt me. He didn't have to. He made it clear that I had demonstrated that I had limits, which made me a liability too. She looked at Silas. I left St. Louis that night. I left everything except what I could fit in 2 trunks. I went east first to mislead anyone who might follow, then west, then to a placement agency that matched women to frontier marriages, because it was the only option that put me somewhere a man like Voss couldn't easily reach or easily search. She breathed out. The agency placed me with you. The cabin was quiet. Silas looked at his closed fist on the table, opened it slowly, looked at her. The boy, he said. The one you operated on. He lived, she said again. Where is he now? I don't know. It cost her something to say that. He could see it. I left before I could find out. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the fire and was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder what the silence meant, and whether she'd misjudged in telling him, whether she'd built something in these weeks that was now going to come apart under the weight of what she'd just put on the table. Then he said, "The boot prints on the northern trail." "I don't know if they're connected," she said quickly. "It could be anyone." "It could be," he said. He didn't sound like he believed that any more than she did. "Voss, is he the kind of man who sends people or comes himself?" "Sends people. He doesn't travel. He sends 2 or 3 men, and they're not cautious, they're effective." Silas was quiet again. Then he said in a voice that was very simple and very certain, "Anyone looking for you has to come through my mountain to get here. And I know this mountain a lot better than anyone he'd send." She looked at him. "Silas, I don't want you involved in—" "I'm already involved," he said. "You're in my house. You've been running my trap line for 5 days with bleeding hands, and you burned my cornbread." He paused. "That makes you my business." She stared at him. "That is the most unreasonable logic I have ever heard," she said. "Probably," he agreed, "but that's where we are." She didn't know what to say. She'd been carrying the weight of Harlan Voss's name and what it meant for so many months that she'd stopped imagining what it would feel like to put it down. She'd assumed it wasn't something that could be put down, just carried, redistributed, managed. She had not expected a man in a log cabin at 8,000 feet to look at the whole shape of it and say, "That makes you my business," like it was the simplest thing in the world. It wasn't the simplest thing in the world. She knew that. He knew that. The boot prints on the northern trail were possibly nothing, and possibly the beginning of something neither of them could fully prepare for, and his shoulder was still healing and her hands were still raw, and the winter had a long way to go before it was done with either of them. But she looked at him across the table in the firelight. This man who'd tested her with cold mornings and hard labor and silences that asked nothing, who'd handed her the reins on a mountain road without knowing if she could drive and let her, who'd spent 3 years talking to a tin cup rather than ask the wrong person for something he needed. And she thought that if she was going to be somewhere when whatever was coming finally arrived, she could not have chosen a more honest place to stand. "You should sleep," she said finally. "You came down those stairs too early." "Probably," he said again. He made no move to get up. She didn't push him. She just got up and put more wood on the fire and refilled both their cups, and they sat in the warmth while the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and the snow came down in the dark outside, and neither of them mentioned what was coming next. It would come when it came. Tonight there was just the fire, and the coffee, and the particular quiet of 2 people who have told each other the hard true thing and discovered they're still in the same room. That was enough for tonight. 3 days after Evelyn told him everything, the second set of boot prints appeared. These were closer. Silas found them on the southern approach trail, less than a mile from the cabin, pressed into fresh snow that had fallen the night before. 2 sets this time, not one, both heading uphill in the direction of the clearing. He crouched over them in the early morning gray and studied the depth, the stride length, the spacing. These men weren't wandering. They were moving with intention, with the careful, measured pace of people following directions toward a specific destination. He didn't rush back. Rushing communicated panic, and he needed to think clearly before he went through that door and changed everything in the cabin. He stood on the trail in the cold and looked uphill toward where the cabin sat invisible through the timber, smoke rising, Evelyn inside doing whatever she was doing at this hour, feeding the stove, working through the food inventory she'd been reorganizing all week, possibly reading one of the books she'd brought in the trunks. He thought about what he knew and what he didn't know. He knew 2 men had come up from the valley, following the southern trail, which was the most direct route from Harwick. He knew they'd been moving after the last snowfall, which meant sometime after midnight. He knew they hadn't made camp anywhere he could see, which meant they were either pushing through without stopping, or they'd camped somewhere below his range of vision. He didn't know if they were Voss's men. He didn't know if they were simply trappers or prospectors or lost travelers who had no business with anyone on this mountain. He knew the probability distribution of those options, and it wasn't balanced. He went back to the cabin. Evelyn was at the stove. She looked at his face when he came through the door, and the wooden spoon in her hand went still. "Tell me," she said. He told her. 2 sets of prints, Southern Trail, close. Her face didn't collapse the way he'd half expected. He'd watched her manage her fear before, and he'd seen how much effort that management cost her. The small tightening around the eyes, the way her breath became slightly too controlled. He saw all of that now, and beneath it the particular stillness of a person who has been anticipating something for so long that when it arrives there's almost a grim relief mixed in with the dread. "How long?" she asked. "Hard to say. They were moving last night. Could be down the mountain waiting and watching. Could be closer." She set the spoon down, turned fully to face him. "What do we do?" He noticed she said "we" without hesitation, and he noticed he didn't hesitate before answering. "First, you don't go outside alone, not for any reason." He pulled his coat back off its hook. "Second, I need to know everything about how Voss operates. When he sends people for something like this, what do? Do they wait and watch, or do they move directly?" She thought about it seriously, not rushing to an answer. That was one of the things he'd come to rely on. She didn't give you a quick answer to make you feel better. She gave you the true one when she had it. "They watch first," she said. "At least a day. Voss wants information before action. He'd want to know who's here, what the layout is, whether I'm alone." A pause. "They won't know about you. He found the agency placement. He wouldn't know the details of what he'd find here." "So they're watching?" "Probably. Today, at least." Silas nodded. "Then today we act normal. I run the trap line, the usual route, nothing changed. You stay inside, fire running, normal smoke pattern. We give them nothing to react to." She looked at him steadily. "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow depends on what they do today." He could see her working through the logic of that, testing it. She didn't argue with it, which meant she'd reached the same conclusion independently. "Silas." Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not fear exactly, but something close to the territory of it. "If this goes wrong, it won't." "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know this mountain, and they don't, and that matters more than you think." He put his hand briefly on the table between them, not quite touching hers. "I've been up here 3 years. There's only 2 approaches where a man can move quickly. There are 6 approaches where they can't. If I need to, I can make this mountain very difficult for people who don't know it." She looked at his hand on the table, then at his face. "Don't do anything that... Don't put yourself in unnecessary danger. For me." "I'll do what's necessary," he said. "Same as you've been doing." He went out before she could answer. The day was the longest he could remember, and he'd had some long ones. He ran the trap line with his rifle over his shoulder instead of in his hands, which was its own kind of message to anyone watching. "I'm armed, I'm comfortable, I belong here." He moved at his usual pace through the usual route and kept his peripheral vision working at the edges of the timber, watching for anything that didn't fit the pattern of a mountain in early winter. A bird flushing wrong, snow falling from a branch with no wind to cause it. The particular silence that falls in a forest when a human presence has disturbed the ambient sounds. He found the camp on his 3rd pass of the northern perimeter. Tucked behind a rock shelf 200 yards from the cabin's sight line, small fire burned down to cold ash, 2 bedrolls. They'd stayed the night here, which meant they'd been watching the cabin since before dawn. He memorized the location and kept moving. Coming back in the afternoon, he saw the smoke from his chimney steady and even against the white sky, which meant Evelyn had kept the stove managed correctly all day. He stood at the timber edge for a moment, watching the cabin. No sign of disturbance, no tracks in the clearing that weren't his from the morning departure. Inside, she had food on the stove, and her face was pale and composed, and she'd clearly spent the day managing her own mind through sheer willpower. "Well," she said, "found their camp, cold now. They moved sometime today." He hung up his coat. "They're watching, getting familiar with the layout." "How many exits did they count?" He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this all day." "I've been thinking about this for months," she said. "How many exits?" "From what they can see, 2 obvious ones. The front door and the lean-to side. They can't see the root cellar hatch from the north approach." He sat down at the table. "And they don't know the Ridgeline Trail." "What's the Ridgeline Trail?" "Old Elk Path, Runs along the back of the property line about 40 yards uphill from the cabin. In summer, it's visible. Right now, it's under 2 feet of snow and looks like the rest of the mountain. He looked at her. I know where it is in the dark by feel. She sat down across from him. The stove ticked and the wind was picking up outside with the sound of the system that had been building in the northwest for the past 2 days. The serious kind, the settling kind. They'll move tomorrow, she said. If they're going to move, Voss doesn't pay people to watch indefinitely. They'll have been given a timeline. I think so too. He looked at the fire. I want you to do something tonight that you're not going to like. She waited. I want you to pack what you can't leave without into one bag. Just one. Medical case and the wooden one. Whatever else fits. He met her eyes. Not because we're running, but because I want it ready, and I don't want to be packing in a hurry if the situation requires it. She held his gaze for a moment. All right. You're not going to argue? You said we're not running. I believe you. A pause. Are we not running? We're not running, he said. But being prepared isn't the same as running. You of all people know that. She was quiet for a second. Then, you're right. I'll pack after dinner. They ate, and she packed, and Silas cleaned the rifle again and loaded both the rifle and the short-barreled shotgun that lived under his workbench, which he'd had up here for 3 years and never fired at anything other than the occasional predator coming after the animals. He loaded it and set it within reach of the door and sat in the chair that faced the window and waited for the night. Evelyn didn't go behind her curtain. She took the other chair close to the stove and opened a book she didn't read. He could tell she wasn't reading because the pages didn't move. Tell me something, she said somewhere around 9 o'clock. What? Anything, something real. She looked at the fire. I've been in my own head all day and I need to hear someone else talk. He thought about it. When I first came up here, he said, I didn't know what I was doing. I'd trapped some, with Kale, but I'd never run a line solo and I didn't know the mountain. First winter I lost 12 sets to my own mistakes. Wrong placement, wrong trigger tension, wrong everything. He shifted in the chair. There was a week in February that first year when I didn't catch anything. Not because the animals weren't there, but because I was doing it wrong and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. What changed? I stopped trying to remember what I'd been taught and started watching what was actually in front of me. The animals. The way they moved, where they went, what time of day they went there. I stopped imposing what I expected and started seeing what was. He paused. Took me almost the whole first winter to figure that out. Seemed obvious after. She was quiet, looking at the fire. My father said something like that once. He said most of medicine is learning to see the patient in front of you instead of the patient you expect. Smart man, Silas said, the same thing he'd said on the road weeks ago. He was, she said, the same way she'd said it then, but this time she added, he would have liked it up here, the quiet. She glanced around the cabin. He would have liked your books. What was his name? Edmund. She smiled slightly to herself, in the way you smile at something that hurts in a good direction. Edmund Blackthorne. He had terrible handwriting, and he could never remember where he'd put things, and he made the best coffee I've ever had, and I still don't know how. What was in it? He said chicory, but I used chicory once, and it wasn't the same. Her smile faded slowly. I think it was just him. Some things only taste right when a specific person makes them. Silas thought about the coffee his mother had made. He hadn't thought about that in years. Yeah, he said, I know what you mean. They sat with that for a while, and the fire burned, and outside the wind had shifted fully to the northwest and was coming in low and hard against the cabin walls. And the first serious gusts of the new storm were finding every gap in the chinking and making the candle on the table gutter in small, cold drafts. He was watching the window when the shadow crossed it. Not wind, not a branch. A solid mass moving across the dim, pale rectangle of the window from right to left, low and deliberate. He was out of the chair before he'd made a conscious decision to move, his hand on Evelyn's arm. Behind the stove, he said, very quietly. Right now. She moved without a sound. He took the rifle and positioned himself to the left of the door where he wouldn't be in the direct line if it opened, and he waited. The knock, when it came, was 3 raps. Hard, evenly spaced. The knock of someone who wanted to be heard and was not pretending to be friendly about it. Silas didn't move for 5 full seconds. Then he said loudly, "Who's there?" A pause outside. Then a voice, male, flat, with the unhurried quality of a person who has done uncomfortable things professionally and stopped being bothered by them. "We're looking for a woman named Evelyn Blackthorne. We know she's in there. Open the door, and this goes easy." Behind the stove, he heard Evelyn's breath catch. Just once. Then nothing. "There's no one here by that name," Silas said. "Mr. Ashcroft." His name in their mouth hit wrong. "We know about the marriage arrangement. We know about the stagecoach at Cutter's Bend. We've talked to people there. So let's not waste each other's time. Open the door, let us take the woman, and you go back to whatever you were doing before this became your problem." "She's not your property to take," Silas said. A longer pause. When the voice came back, it was still flat, but the unhurried quality had sharpened slightly at the edges. "We're not here for a debate. We're here for the woman. You've got till I count to 10, or we come through the door regardless." Silas looked at the shotgun by the door. He looked at the rifle in his hands. He looked at the window. One of them outside, but you didn't send one man to do a 2-man job. The second one would be at the lean-to side, or possibly the root cellar. "Evelyn," he said, low and level, "is the hatch bolted?" From behind the stove, barely audible. "Yes." "Good." The count started outside. He heard it through the door, unhurried, like someone going through a routine they'd done before. At 7, Silas made a decision. He went to the door, set his hand on the latch, and opened it. The man outside was broad through the shoulders, mid-40s, wearing a heavy coat with the collar up and a hat pulled to his eyebrows against the wind. He had a revolver in his right hand held low, not pointed yet, the carry of a man who expected compliance and had the gun out as punctuation rather than threat. There was a second shape in his peripheral vision, moving along the cabin wall to the right. "Smart," the man said, and started forward. He stopped when he registered the rifle. "Here's how this works," Silas said. He kept his voice at the same level it had been through the door. No higher, no lower. "You're in my doorway. If that revolver comes up, I put you down before it clears your hip. Your partner on the side of the cabin is about to find out that the north wall doesn't have any entry points, so he's spending time for nothing." He paused. "And in about 6 hours, that system coming in from the northwest is going to drop 3 feet of snow on this mountain. I know where the safe shelter is. You don't." The man's eyes were steady and calculating, not scared. Silas hadn't expected scared, but calculating meant he was still thinking, and still thinking meant there was something to work with. "Voss isn't going to let this go," the man said. "That's between Voss and me," Silas said. "Right now, I'm talking to you. You go back down the mountain tonight before that storm sets in. You make it to Harwick. You wait it out. You go back to wherever you came from, and you tell Voss she's not here." He held the man's eyes. "Or you can push this, and this mountain decides it for both of us, and I promise you the mountain doesn't care who either one of us works for." The wind hit them both in that moment. A hard gust from the northwest that drove snow sideways across the clearing and made the lantern light from inside the cabin flicker and strain. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the last hour. Silas could feel it. So could the man in front of him, whose face went tight against the cold. A long silence. The second man had come around the corner and stopped when he saw the situation at the door. The broad-shouldered man looked at Silas, at the rifle, at the sky above the clearing, where the cloud layer had moved in fully and was pressing down heavy and dark and moving fast. He put the revolver away. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Silas said. The 2 men turned and walked across the clearing without rushing, disappeared into the timber heading south, toward the lower trail, toward Harwick. Silas watched the tree line for 5 full minutes after they were gone before he closed the door. He set the rifle down against the wall and turned around. Evelyn was standing at the edge of the stove. She'd come out from behind it at some point. He didn't know when. She was standing very straight in the way she stood when something had cost her, and she was holding the cost together by posture alone. She said nothing. He crossed the cabin and stood in front of her and looked at her face. Her jaw was set, her eyes were dry, and her hands at her sides were shaking slightly in a way she probably didn't know about. "They're gone," he said. She nodded once. "For now," she said. "For now," he agreed. The wind drove against the cabin in a long, sustained gust that made the walls groan and sent a skirling draft through the gap at the base of the door. The temperature inside dropped noticeably. Silas looked at the window and then at the stove. "Big storm," he said. "If it's what I think it is, we could lose the fire overnight if we're not careful." "Tell me what to do," she said. So he did. They worked for an hour, banking the stove properly with the largest split logs, stuffing the door gap with an old blanket, hanging the extra quilt across the window on the hooks he'd put there for exactly this purpose. He brought in as much wood as the interior could hold, stacking it in rows against the wall beside the door. The cabin grew incrementally warmer as they worked, which was deceptive. The warmth was borrowed, stored, and the storm outside was going to test how much of it they could hold through the night. By the time they were done, it was close to midnight, and the storm had fully arrived, pressing on the cabin from all sides with the sound of something that had no intention of being brief about it. The candles were down to stubs. The lamp was turned low to save the oil. Silas sat on the floor with his back against the wall nearest the stove, where the radiated heat was strongest, and looked at the fire through the stove's draft vent. The orange pulse of it, steady and alive. The only thing between them and the cold that was sitting on the other side of every wall. Evelyn sat beside him, not behind the curtain, not across the room. Beside him, close enough that her shoulder was almost against his, and she pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and looked at the same small orange light he was looking at. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The storm pushed, and the cabin held, and the fire burned, and outside the snow was coming down in the way it came down up here when it meant it, not falling so much as arriving, filling the world from the ground up, burying everything that wasn't strong enough to push back. After a while, the cold started winning, despite their preparations. He could feel it in his feet and in the left shoulder that still ached in cold weather, and in the way his breath was visible in the dimming light. He made a practical calculation and then made the harder decision, which was not to overthink it. "Come here," he said. She looked at him. "Cold's going to get worse before morning," he said. "Body heat is more efficient than what's left in that stove." She held his gaze for a moment. He watched her parse the offer for what it was and was not, watched her decide. She unfolded from her position and moved against his side, and he put his arm around her shoulders the way you do a thing when you've decided it's the right thing and you're not going to make a production out of it. And she settled against him without stiffness, without ceremony, and after a few minutes some of the shaking that had been in her since the men came to the door finally went still. He could feel her breathing slow. The storm went on for hours. At some point the last candle went out, and there was only the ember glow through the stove vent painting the wall in low red light, and the sound of the wind and the sound of them breathing. He didn't sleep. He kept his eyes on the door and his mind on the mountain and the southern trail and the two men making their way down through 3 feet of new snow in the dark, and he thought about what came next with the clarity that came to him sometimes in the long, cold hours when there was nothing to do but think honestly. What came next was complicated. It always was. Voss wouldn't stop. That was true. And he'd known it was true when he'd said what he'd said in the doorway, and the man he'd said it to had known it too. What he'd bought tonight was time, not resolution. Time and a storm and whatever margin the mountain could provide. But sitting in the dark with Evelyn's weight against his shoulder and the fire holding on and the cabin holding on, he found that complicated felt manageable in a way it hadn't seemed manageable for years. He stayed awake until the storm began, very slowly, to quiet. It was 4 a.m, maybe later. The wind had dropped from its full roar to something lower, a long, sustained moan instead of a shout. The temperature inside had stabilized, cold, but not dangerous. The stove still had coals. Evelyn was asleep against his shoulder, deeply and without the 2 a.m. waking he'd grown used to hearing from the loft. Her breath was even, and her hands in her lap had finally gone loose and open. He sat with the dying fire and the quiet storm and the particular feeling of a man who has said, "This is my business," out loud to the night, and meant it. And he stayed exactly where he was until morning came gray and still through the ice-crusted window, and the mountain outside was white and buried and absolute. And the cabin was standing, and they were both inside it. That was enough to build from. The morning after the storm, the world outside the cabin was unrecognizable. 3.5 feet of new snow had come down overnight, filling the clearing to the fence posts, burying the woodpile to its second row, covering the lean-to roof in a weight that Silas assessed from the doorway with the practiced eye of a man who knew exactly how much his structures could hold before something gave. The sky had gone pale blue and clear, the particular hard clarity that comes after a big system passes through and leaves everything rinsed and silent. Evelyn stood beside him in the doorway with her coffee and looked at all of it. She'd woken sometime around 6, still against his shoulder, and had straightened up without fuss or embarrassment and gone to rebuild the fire. He'd heard her moving, heard the familiar sounds of the morning routine, the kindling, the damper, the water going on, and had stayed where he was against the wall for a few minutes longer before getting up, because his back ached and his shoulder ached, and he was 50% certain that if he stood too quickly, he'd see spots. They hadn't talked about the men who'd come to the door. Not yet. There was a practical understanding between them that some conversations needed daylight and full consciousness and both hands free, not the wrung-out hours before dawn. "The lean-to needs clearing," he said, looking at the roof load. "I know. I'll do the near side while you rest that shoulder." "I don't need to rest, Silas." She said it with her eyes still on the snow-covered clearing, calm, final. He'd stopped arguing with that tone 2 weeks ago because it saved time. "The near side," he said, "and don't get on the roof." "I wasn't planning to get on the roof." "I know, I'm saying it anyway." She glanced at him sideways, something in her face that wasn't quite a smile. "You're managing me." "I am absolutely managing you," he said, and went to get the long-handled snow rake from the lean-to side door. They spent the morning digging out. It was hard work and slow work, and neither of them talked much while they did it, which was fine. There was a kind of communication in shared hard work that didn't need language. He watched her figure out the weight distribution of a loaded snow shovel on her second throw. The first had gone wrong and dumped half the load back on her boots, which she accepted with a word he pretended not to hear. And she watched him figure out that his shoulder wasn't as functional as he told himself it was. And she didn't say anything about that either. They just adjusted. He took the rake, she took the shovel. It worked better that way. By noon the lean-to was cleared, the path to the well was open, and the woodpile had been dug out and assessed. Enough wood for 3 weeks, possibly 4 if they were careful. The animals were fed and alive, and the old mare had developed an opinion about the snow depth that she communicated by refusing to walk through it, which cost Silas 15 minutes of negotiation he hadn't planned for. He came back inside with hay on his coat and blood back in his face from the cold, and Evelyn put a bowl in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate. And then she set down her spoon and said, "We need to talk about what happens next." "I know," he said. "They'll come back." "Yes. Not the same 2 men, maybe, but someone." She folded her hands on the table. "Voss doesn't stop. That's not how he operates. He'll recalibrate, figure out the situation better, figure out that you're here, figure out that the direct approach didn't work, and he'll try something else." "What else does he try?" She thought about it. "Leverage. Information. He'll look for something that gives him a position. He'll find out who you are if he hasn't already. He'll look for debt, for legal trouble, for anything he can use as a handle." She met his eyes. "He's patient. That's what makes him dangerous. He's not angry. He's just thorough." Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside the window, the blue sky was still hard and clear, and the snow on the clearing threw back the light in a way that was almost too bright to look at. "Then we need a handle he can't use," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means if he's thorough, we need to be thorough first." He set the cup down. "I know a man in Harwick, Marshal named Croft. He's not the cleanest person in the territory, but he's the law, and he has contacts east. If we can get him information about Voss, specific information, things that could be used officially." Evelyn was very still. "That's dangerous. If Voss finds out someone is building a case against him, he won't know who's building it. Croft protects his sources, at least when it matters to him." He looked at her. "You said Voss had men who got hurt in ways that needed unofficial medicine. You treated them. You kept records. You said he wanted records in a specific way." "He did." "Do you remember what was in them?" She held his gaze. "I remember everything in them. I have a good memory for medical detail." A pause. Some of those men, the injuries, the timing, the nature of them, they corresponded to events, things that were in the papers, things that the St. Louis authorities were looking for connections to. Can you write it down? Not everything, just what's verifiable. She was quiet for a long moment. He could see the calculation going on behind her eyes. Not fear of the work, but the careful weighing of risk against risk, the kind of thinking she was practiced at. If I write it down, she said slowly, and it reaches the wrong hands first, it won't go through the wrong hands. I ride to Harwick, I go directly to Croft, I give it to him myself. He paused. The trail's going to be passable in 4 or 5 days once this snow compacts, before Voss has time to send anyone else. That shoulder can't manage a 4-hour ride in 5 days. Then 7 days. She looked at him. He looked at her. All right, she said. She wrote for 3 evenings at the table while he read or maintained gear or simply sat and did not crowd her, which was its own kind of effort, giving a person room to do something difficult without filling the silence with noise. She wrote in a hand that was small and exact, the way she did everything, and she didn't share it as she went. He didn't ask. It wasn't his information. It was hers, and she was choosing to use it, and that was a different thing from him needing to supervise it. On the 3rd evening, she set down the pen and sat back and looked at the pages. It's enough, she said, if Croft gives it to the right people. The timing on 2 of the incidents alone, she stopped. It's enough. He got up and looked at the pages over her shoulder without picking them up. The handwriting was dense and precise, dates and names and injury descriptions that meant things to her that they didn't mean to him. The internal vocabulary of a medical record that told a story he couldn't fully read, but that he understood the shape of. It's good work, he said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. I've been carrying this information around for 8 months wondering what to do with it, wondering if there was anything to do with it. She picked up the pages, evened them against the table. My father would have said, do it sooner. You didn't have someone to take it to sooner. She looked up at him. He meant it practically. She seemed to receive it as something slightly more than that. Neither of them addressed the difference. He rode to Harwick on the 8th day. The shoulder protested for the first hour and then went numb, which he decided to count as an improvement. The trail was compacted and clear in the upper section, sloppy and broken in the lower elevation where the snow had started melting against south-facing slopes, and his horse picked her way through it with the careful unhappiness of an animal that remembered summer. Croft was in his office. He was a short man with a gray mustache and the eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for 30 years and had developed opinions about human nature accordingly. He listened to Silas without interrupting, which was either a good sign or the sign of a man who'd learned that letting people finish was more useful than cutting them off. When Silas was done, Croft looked at the folded pages for a while without touching them. Harlan Voss, he said. You know the name. I know the name? He picked up the pages, unfolded them. Read the first page with his face doing nothing particular, which in Silas's experience meant the content was significant enough that he was actively controlling his reaction. Where'd she get this? She treated the men. She was there. She kept records. She has a good memory. Croft looked up from the pages. She'd have to testify. Eventually. If this goes where it could go. We know that. That's dangerous for her. I know that too. Silas held the marshal's eyes. She knows it. She's making the choice with the information she has. Croft looked at the pages again. I have a contact in the federal marshal's office, Kansas City. He's been building a file on Voss's operations for 2 years. He set the pages down flat on the desk. This is specific enough to matter, the kind of specific that makes other things connect. How long? For what? For it to become something that protects her. Croft picked up the pages and squared them against his desk and didn't answer immediately, which was honest at least. He wasn't going to give Silas a number that made things feel simpler than they were. Months, he said finally. This goes to Kansas City, they corroborate, they build on it. Months. Maybe less if what she's given me connects the way I think it might. A pause. And in the meantime, she stays on the mountain. Croft looked at him. Something shifted in the marshal's expression. Not quite sympathy, but a recognition of something. "You know what you're taking on," he said. "I know what I'm keeping," Silas said. He was back on the mountain before dark. Evelyn heard his horse and was standing in the doorway when he rode into the clearing, and he could see from 30 yards away that she'd been managing herself carefully all day, keeping occupied, keeping useful, doing the work that needed doing, and not sitting still long enough to let fear fill the available space. He recognized that strategy. He'd used it himself for 3 years. He dismounted and led the horse to the lean-to, and she waited in the doorway without coming to meet him, which he understood. You don't run at news you're not sure of. He got the horse settled and walked to the door. "Croft knows the name," he said. "He has a contact in Kansas City who's been building a case for 2 years. Your information goes to him." She stood very still. "He said months," Silas said, "before it becomes something official, before there's a legal reason for Voss to back down." She nodded slowly. "And until then?" "Until then, you stay here." He held her gaze. "Unless you want to go somewhere else. That's a decision that's yours to make." She looked at him for a long moment. At the cabin behind him, the smoke from the chimney, the cleared path, the lean-to he'd built out with his own hands, the woodpile they'd worked all autumn to build. At the mountain beyond it, the pine ridges and the white slopes and the specific quality of the late afternoon light that came through at this elevation in winter, pure and horizontal and cold. "I don't want to go somewhere else," she said. He nodded. "Then come inside," he said. "It's cold." She almost smiled. "It's always cold." "Less cold inside." She stepped back to let him through. The months that followed were not simple. Silas had not promised her simple, and she had not asked for it, and the mountain honored neither of their preferences on that front. There were weeks in January when the cold was genuinely dangerous, when the animals needed checking twice a night, and the water froze in the bucket inside the cabin if the stove dropped below a certain level, and they slept in shifts to keep the fire, and neither of them talked about how normal it had started to feel to be aware of where the other person was in the room at all times. There were hard days. Days when Silas's shoulder ached badly enough that he was short-tempered and withdrew in the way men withdraw when they don't want to admit they're struggling, going silent and doing too much. Days when Evelyn, for no reason she could identify cleanly, woke with the weight of everything she'd left behind pressing on her chest. Her father's rooms, the people she'd treated, the city she'd run from, the boy she'd operated on whose fate she still didn't know. And couldn't shake it off until late afternoon. They were not always good at handling each other on those days. He said the wrong thing once in February, blunt in the way he could be when he was tired and in pain, something about her city habits that hit harder than he'd meant. And she went behind the curtain and he heard nothing from that side of the cabin for 2 hours, which was worse than an argument. He sat at the table and felt the specific discomfort of a man who knows he's done something and can't think of a way to undo it cleanly. He knocked on the wall beside the curtain. "I was unkind," he said. "I'm sorry." A silence. Then, "I know you didn't mean it the way it landed. Doesn't matter how I meant it." Another silence. "No," she said. "It doesn't, but it matters a little." He stood at the curtain with his hand on the wall. "I don't have much practice saying things carefully." "I know that," she said. "I have too much practice saying things carefully and not enough practice saying them honestly." A pause. "We're not good at the same things, which is probably useful." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He went and put water on instead. She came out 20 minutes later and sat at the table, and they drank their coffee, and neither of them brought it up again, which was not avoidance, but completion. The word from Croft came in March, carried up by a writer he'd sent specifically, which meant the news was significant enough to justify the effort. Silas read the letter at the table with Evelyn across from him, and then he handed it to her and watched her read it. The federal marshal's office in Kansas City had executed arrests on 4 members of Harlan Voss's organization, including 2 men who had subsequently agreed to provide testimony in exchange for consideration of their charges. The information Evelyn had provided had been described in the letter as a significant contribution to connecting the timeline of events. Voss himself had not been arrested, not yet, but was, in the language of the letter, under active investigation and had been made aware that further actions against witnesses or potential witnesses would be considered obstruction of federal process. Not finished, but changed. Evelyn set the letter down. She looked at her hands on the table. The hands that had changed so much in 4 months. Rough now, capable. Nothing like the gloved hands at Cutter's Bend. She looked at them for a long time. "It's not over," she said. "No," he said, "but it's different." "Yes." She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but something in them had moved. Not relief, not quite, but the beginning of the long exhale that relief eventually becomes when you've been holding your breath for most of a year. "The boy," she said. "The 17-year-old. He waited. One of the men who's testifying, Croft's contact included a note. The boy's name was Thomas Welch. He recovered fully. She stopped. "He's working in a print shop in East St. Louis." Silas looked at her. She pressed her lips together once, hard, and then let it go. "Okay," she said quietly. To herself, mostly. "Okay?" He didn't say anything. Some things don't need commentary. The boy was alive and working in a print shop, and she'd saved him with whatever she'd had in a back room in the middle of the night, and that fact had been suspended for 8 months somewhere between her action and its outcome, and now it had landed, and she was allowed to feel the weight of it landing without anyone around her making it about something else. He got up and put more wood on the fire. Spring came the way spring comes at altitude, reluctantly and in stages, and with frequent reminders that it was not fully committed. March was mostly still winter. April was a negotiation. But by May, the snow in the clearing had pulled back to the shadow side of the cabin wall, and the trail to Harwick was running mud but passable, and the aspen along the lower ridge were putting out the first pale green that would in 2 weeks become full leaf. Silas was splitting wood on the morning of a day in early May when something made him stop and look up. He didn't know what. Just a shift in the quality of the morning, something in the air or the light, or the way the birds had stopped their noise briefly, and he stood with the axe hanging from his hand and looked at the clearing. It looked like his clearing. It looked like it had always looked, except there were 2 coffee cups drying on the porch rail that he hadn't put there. There was a second pair of boots by the door, smaller than his, worn now and creased from months of actual use. There was smoke from the chimney and a book left face down on the porch step, and a line of freshly washed cloth hung between the post and the pine at the corner, evidence of a life that had grown in this place from outside of him. He'd spent 3 years making himself comfortable with solitude, telling himself that what he'd lost at Whitmore Creek and other places before and after had made him someone who worked better alone, who needed less than other people seemed to need, who had chosen the mountain because the mountain asked nothing of him that he couldn't give. He had been wrong about all of that, it turned out. Not completely wrong. He did work well alone. He did need less company than most. The mountain was still the right place for him, and he had not changed into someone he wasn't, but wrong about the central thing, which was that needing less meant needing nothing, and that the absence of something painful was the same as the presence of something good. The door opened behind him. "Coffee's on," Evelyn said. She came out onto the porch with her own cup and looked at the morning, at the green coming into the aspens, at the blue strip of sky above the ridge, at the mud and the snow remnants, and the particular quality of the May light that was softer than winter but hadn't gotten to warm yet. "It's beautiful up here," she said. It surprised him. Not because it wasn't true, but because she hadn't said it before, not in those words, not simply and directly like that. In the winter, she'd described the mountain in practical terms, the conditions, the resources, the risks. This was different. This was someone saying, "I see where I am, and I find it good." "Yeah," he said. She stood beside him with her cup, and they both looked at the aspens. "Voss," she said, "eventually there'll be more from Croft." "Eventually," he agreed. "I think about going back sometimes. To St. Louis, if it becomes safe." He looked at her. She was looking at the aspens. "And?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything honestly when she had enough time and space to do it. "And I don't know what I'd go back to. The people I treated, some of them are gone, moved, some of them probably found someone else." A pause. "I'm not the same person who left either. I don't know if I fit back into that shape." "You could practice here," he said. "Harwick doesn't have a physician. Croft mentioned it once." She looked at him. He mentioned it once, Silas said, and I didn't tell you because I didn't know how, and because it wasn't my information to give, and because I didn't want you to think I was... He stopped. I didn't want you to think I was trying to keep you. She was quiet. Are you? She said. He looked at the mud and the clearing and the aspens and the sky. Yes, he said. I'd like you to stay. Not because of the work, not because of the arrangement we wrote to an agency about, but because... He stopped again, which was a familiar problem. The words he had were always outnumbered by the things he meant. Because this place is better with you in it. I'm better with you in it. And I know that's not a small thing to ask, and I know there are things you want and places you might need to go, and I'm not asking you to give any of that up. She looked at her coffee cup. What are you asking? She said. I'm asking if you want to be here. Not because you need to hide. Not because there's nowhere else. Because you want to. The aspens moved in the light morning wind. A bird started up somewhere in the timber. The mud in the clearing was softening at the edges where the sun hit it first. My father's instruments are in the trunk, she said, and the trunks are in your cabin. She looked up at him. I think that's the most honest answer I can give you right now. He considered that. It's enough, he said. She nodded once and looked back at the morning. There are people who fall into love like falling into water. Sudden, dramatic, all at once, and certain of it. That is one true story about how it happens. There is another true story, less told, about the people who come to it the way spring comes to a mountain, in stages, reluctant, with reversals, with mornings that feel like winter again, right in the middle of May. And then one day you look up, and the aspens are green, and the mud is softening, and there's a second pair of boots by your door, worn from real use. Silas Ashcroft had been a man who talked to a tin cup and called it Douglas. Evelyn Blackthorne had been a woman who'd crossed a continent with her father's instruments and someone else's name to hide behind. They were not simple people. They were not healed people. Not the way that word gets used to mean finished and resolved and without remainder. He still woke sometimes with the sound of Whitmore Creek in his head. She still pressed her lips together hard when something hit the place where fear used to live and hadn't entirely vacated. But they were honest people, and they were stubborn. And they had both, separately and then together, learned that surviving something is not the same as living through it, and that the difference between those two things is whether you let someone stand close enough to see the parts that cost you. The mountain was still the mountain, hard, indifferent, demanding its due from every living thing that tried to make a home on its slopes. It didn't care about their history, or their damage, or their careful progress towards something neither of them had fully named yet. But they knew it now. Its trails, its weather patterns, its moods. The way the light came through the aspens in May, and the way the wind came down off the North Ridge in November, and what the sky looked like 2 hours before it decided to bury you. Knowledge earned is different from knowledge given, and the kind of home you build with your own hands out of difficult material is different from the kind you're handed, and the kind of trust that survives a winter like the one they'd survived is different from the kind that starts out easy. When Evelyn went back inside to tend the stove, Silas picked up the axe and split wood in the soft May morning and listened to the aspens moving and the bird in the timber and the sound of the cabin doing what cabins do when someone is inside them, living. He had written a letter once to strangers asking for a practical arrangement. He had gotten something he hadn't known how to ask for from a woman who hadn't known she was carrying it. That was luck. Accidental and unearned, and not something either of them would have designed. But everything after that was choice, made daily, in the cold and the dark, and the hard work of being honest with another person when it would have been easier to be alone. That part they'd earned. And that part, the mountain couldn't take.